From battlefield genius to palace prisoner, Belisarius embodied Rome's final great act on history's stage. When enemies surrounded the dying empire, Justinian found in this Thracian soldier something time had nearly forgotten: brilliance matched with absolute loyalty. He reclaimed lost provinces from Vandals and Goths alike, and still, each victory only deepened the shadow of imperial suspicion. His story reveals the tragic paradox of service. The greater his triumphs, the more dangerous his fame became. While Constantinople's halls echoed with whispers of treason, Belisarius fought for an idea of Rome that survived only in memory. A general who conquered kingdoms but could not defeat envy. The empire did not fall in a single night. It faded, like a fire burned too long, its embers glowing beneath the ash. When the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus laid down his diadem in 476 AD, and the barbarian chieftain Odoacer sent the imperial insignia eastward to Constantinople, the Roman world seemed to sigh and settle into ruin. Yet Rome, like an old god, could not die. Its body had been broken, but its spirit survived. In the east, in the city of Constantine, where the Bosporus met the sea, and where the ghost of empire still drew breath, Constantinople was no longer the Rome of marble forums and Latin orators. It was a city of domes and mosaics, where Greek hymns echoed beneath vaults of gold. From its 7 hills, the emperor ruled over Egypt's deserts, the Aegean's islands, and the smoking mountains of Armenia. Grain ships still crossed the sea, coins still glittered with the image of Caesar, and the armies still called themselves legions, though their ranks were filled with Isaurians, Huns, and Goths. The empire was no longer a people. It was a system, a habit of power that had forgotten how to stop. But it was an empire grown brittle with age. The Balkan plains had become a graveyard of forts and burned villages, where Slavs and Bulgars raided through the mountain passes each spring. To the east, Persia waited, patient, implacable. The Sassanid kings dreaming of the day they would take Antioch and drive their banners to the sea. The frontiers groaned under the cost of defense. The treasury bled itself dry, paying mercenaries who would desert at the first scent of failure. The people endured as they always had, stoic, superstitious, hungry. They prayed to saints and emperors alike, unsure which could still hear them. The amphitheaters had fallen silent, the old gods forgotten. But the crowds still gathered, now in the hippodrome, to cheer the racing factions of blue and green, the new tribes of the capital. Beneath the chants and wagers seethed old class hatreds and new loyalties that could one day ignite the city itself. The Emperor Anastasius, silver-haired and severe, presided over this uneasy peace. A frugal man, he balanced the accounts and built walls along the Thracian frontier, but he could not wall off the fatigue of his age. His ministers spoke of reforms, his generals of frontier wars, but both knew that the empire's soul was weary. It had grown cautious, preferring compromise to courage. Rome's greatness had been forged by men who built roads across deserts and fought until the rivers ran red. Now the bureaucracy worshipped safety more than glory. Yet even in decline, the empire possessed a terrible grandeur. The city glittered like a crown in twilight, its harbors filled with the masts of merchant fleets, its avenues lined with marble porticos, its palaces heavy with the scent of incense and decay. From the walls of Constantinople, one could look eastward across the Golden Horn and imagine that the world still belonged to Rome. It was there, in the rough borderlands beyond Thrace, that a child was born into obscurity, a boy named Flavius Belisarius. His family were provincial farmers, descendants perhaps of soldiers who had been granted land generations earlier, when the legions still ruled the Danube. He grew up among cold hills and restless tribes, in a land where imperial power was a rumor carried by the tax collector and the priest. Yet even here, the echo of Rome lingered, in the Latin prayers of old soldiers, in the eagle carved on a local milestone, in the stories of men who had once conquered the world. The world into which Belisarius was born was one of contradictions, an empire both decaying and enduring, brutal and beautiful. Soldiers still drilled on frozen fields under standards older than their language. Scholars in Alexandria argued the nature of Christ with a ferocity once reserved for war. Traders carried silk and spice from India to the markets of Antioch, while plague and famine shadowed their routes. Monks retreated into caves to seek salvation, while emperors plotted to save the world. In the high corridors of the great palace, power shifted like sand. Eunuchs whispered in the emperor's ear, while generals from the Balkan highlands, tough men hardened by frontier life, rose to command the armies. Among them was a burly soldier named Justin, an Illyrian peasant who had clawed his way from the ranks of the imperial guard to the throne itself. When Anastasius died childless in 518 AD, the court expected another nobleman to inherit the crown. Instead, it was Justin who emerged from the confusion, chosen by the army and acclaimed by the people. The new emperor was unlettered but shrewd, a man who knew the smell of leather and sweat better than that of parchment. Yet behind him stood a younger, sharper mind, his nephew Justinian, a man raised in the same harsh hills as Belisarius, but blessed with a restless, almost divine ambition. Justinian read the laws of Rome as if they were scripture, believed in empire as others believed in God, and dreamed of restoring what had been lost. Justinian's rise marked the beginning of a new fever within the empire, a dangerous mixture of faith and conquest. He spoke of unity, of one God, one law, one empire. He would heal the schism that divided Christendom, codify the laws that governed the world, and reclaim the provinces that had been stolen by barbarians. To some, he seemed a prophet in imperial robes. To others, a fanatic who mistook visions for strategy. But to those who served him, he was the embodiment of destiny, the man who would drag Rome from its grave. Somewhere on the frontier, the young Belisarius was learning the language of command, how to move men across broken terrain, how to listen more than he spoke, how to keep order in the face of hunger and fear. He was quiet, disciplined, and relentless, a soldier who did not complain. It was said that he studied the Persians, watching how they fought, how they used horse archers and armor in concert. Already, he imagined a new kind of Roman army, swift, adaptable, a fusion of discipline and cunning, that could meet the world as it had become, not as it had been. When Justinian looked to his future, he saw in Belisarius a reflection of his own origin, the same hard soil, the same hunger to rise above it. They would ascend together, one through politics, the other through battle. And between them, they would attempt the impossible, to turn the dying light of Rome into a new dawn. For now, the empire still stood, cracked, weary, but standing. The marble domes gleamed above the Bosporus. The legions, ragged and foreign though they were, still carried standards into the wind. And far away, in some forgotten garrison, a young officer drilled his men and dreamed of victories not yet written. The world believed Rome had ended, but history, stubborn and unfinished, was merely taking a breath. When Emperor Justin ascended the throne in 518 AD, few believed the rough soldier from the Balkans would last a year. He had been a swineherd once, a man of calloused hands and blunt speech who had risen through the ranks by courage, not cunning. But the empire had grown used to unlikely saviors, and behind Justin, in the shadow of his new crown, stood a mind far keener than his own. His nephew, Justinian, already ruled in all but name. Justinian had the restless brilliance of a man haunted by destiny. He worked late into the night by lamplight, poring over law codes, theology, and dispatches from the provinces. His clerks whispered that he rarely slept. He spoke of empire not as inheritance, but as vocation, a divine commission to rebuild what time and men had undone. Rome's mission, he believed, had never ended. It had only been interrupted, and he, God's chosen emperor to be, would restore it. In his mind, theology and politics were twin fronts of the same war. Just as schism had divided the church, barbarian kingdoms had divided the world. Heresy and rebellion, east and west, were to be cured alike, through order. His vision was unity absolute, one faith, one law, one empire beneath the eye of God. Yet visions are powerless without hands to wield them, and on the edge of that vast dominion, amid the hard stone of Thrace and Illyria, a young officer was sharpening his own talents, the kind that emperors come to need. Belisarius was barely into his 20s when he entered military service. Even then, men remarked on his composure. He was not given to bluster. His commands were quiet, measured, and impossible to disobey. Where other officers sought glory, he sought understanding of terrain, of men, of the hidden rhythms that decided battles before swords were drawn. The army into which he entered was Roman in name only. The old legions of Caesar had become a patchwork of tongues and loyalties. Heavy infantry still formed the backbone of the army, but their armor was worn thin, their numbers depleted by plague and desertion. To fill the ranks, emperors hired mercenaries, Huns with their hornbows, Gothic horsemen, Heruli marauders tamed by pay, rather than patriotism. It was an army that mirrored the empire itself, resourceful, divided, enduring. Belisarius observed and learned. He saw that the future of war lay not with ponderous infantry, but with speed, with cavalry, archery, and deception. He trained his men to strike, withdraw, and strike again, to move like thought itself. Later, this insight would bloom into the tactical system that astonished both East and West. But for now, he was a young commander, still earning his emperor's trust. Justinian noticed him. Perhaps it was the quiet self-assurance or the intelligence that did not need to advertise itself. The two men shared something fundamental, that hard Illyrian practicality, born of stone villages and long winters. Justinian began to draw Belisarius into his orbit, assigning him to the imperial guard. In the glittering halls of the great palace, the young officer stood among eunuchs, bishops, and courtiers, all of them vying for the attention of the man who would soon be emperor. The empire itself seemed to sense the coming change. Anastasius's prudent peace had given way to ambition. Across the eastern frontier, the Persian king Kavad stirred. Along the Danube, new tribes gathered like thunderheads. And in the heart of Constantinople, the Hippodrome factions, the Blues and the Greens, had become political parties, capable of shaking the capital with a shout. It was a world on the edge of upheaval, awaiting the will of a man strong enough to master it. In 523, Justinian took a step that shocked the old nobility. He married Theodora, a woman from the theatre, once a performer in the city's rougher districts. To the patricians, she was scandal embodied. To Justinian, she was a revelation. Theodora was brilliant, fearless, and utterly without illusion. She had seen the empire from below. from the gutters and alleyways where imperial charity never reached, and she had learned how power moved behind its walls. With her beside him, Justinian no longer feared the court's hypocrisy. He could use it. The marriage made him enemies, but it also gave him strength. Theodora's influence would soon shape decisions that remade the empire, and would one day save both throne and emperor from ruin. By 527 AD, Justin's health had failed. The old soldier who had once guarded the palace gates now lay dying within them. On April 1st, the Senate and army proclaimed Justinian co-emperor. It was an act of inevitability, the transfer of power from the past to the future. The coronation was not a celebration, but a consecration. Priests sang hymns in Greek and Latin. Golden censers smoked in Hagia Sophia, and the new emperor stood beneath the dome with Theodora at his side, already thinking of laws to write and wars to fight. In the same year, Belisarius received his first independent command, the eastern frontier, where the empire faced its oldest enemy. To Justinian, it was a test. To Belisarius, it was an inheritance of iron. The Persian kings had fought the Romans for centuries, their border a scar carved deep across Mesopotamia. The fortress city of Dara stood there, staring across at its Persian twin, Nisibis, two watchers of a world divided. Belisarius took command quietly, as he always did. He inspected his men, their weapons, their walls. He understood that courage was no substitute for discipline, and that no general could win by pride alone. He began to shape the army as a craftsman shapes metal, heating, hammering, and cooling it into unity. The soldiers who served under him would soon learn that obedience was his creed, but so too was fairness. A man who stole from civilians would hang. A man who stood firm in battle would be rewarded beyond his rank. From the marble corridors of the great palace to the dust-choked outposts of Mesopotamia, something was stirring. A sense that the world was about to tilt once more toward greatness or disaster. Justinian's vision reached toward heaven, seeking to bind God and empire in a single law. Belisarius's eyes were on the earth, on the fields where men bled, on the walls that crumbled, on the strategies that might turn a hopeless defense into victory. Neither yet knew how their fates would intertwine, one to dream of empire restored, the other to make that dream real by the sword. Together they would write the last great chapter of Roman history, one born of faith, ambition, and the stubborn refusal of the past to die. The throne was secure. The armies stood ready. Beyond the Euphrates, Persia waited, and in the east, the name Belisarius was about to be spoken with awe. The frontier between Rome and Persia was a landscape built for endurance, a plain of heat and dust, where two empires had stared each other down for centuries. Along that scar of earth lay cities that were more fortresses than homes, their walls the bones of an eternal war. Here the air shimmered with watchfulness. Across the border, the banners of the Sassanids fluttered red and gold. Behind them stretched the might of an empire that claimed descent from the kings of fire. To the west, in the Roman lines, a new commander prepared to meet them. Belisarius had taken command of the Eastern army in the first year of Justinian's reign. He was scarcely 30, too young, some whispered, to bear so old a responsibility. Yet the emperor saw in him a reflection of his own relentless faith, a conviction that discipline could redeem weakness, that order could shape chaos. The two men understood each other. One ruled the empire by law and theology. The other would defend it by geometry and will. From his headquarters in the frontier city of Dara, the general surveyed the flat, brutal plain, where the Persian cavalry loved to fight. The Sassanids had mastered shock warfare, waves of armored horsemen who thundered forward like iron storms, their charge breaking even veteran legions. The Romans had lost battles here for generations. Belisarius studied their failures. He walked the ground himself, measuring distances, tracing lines in the sand with the end of his staff. Then, to the astonishment of his officers, he ordered ditches dug, not straight, but diagonal, slicing across the field like the cuts of a blade. The trenches, 2 men deep and a horse's length wide, formed angled corridors that led nowhere straight. To an untrained eye they looked chaotic, but to Belisarius they were order made visible. Enemy cavalry, rushing forward, would find themselves funneled into narrow kill zones where Roman archers could strike with lethal precision. Never before had a Roman general turned the earth itself into a weapon. By the time the Persians appeared, 40,000 strong under the general Firuz, the plain around Dara had been remade. From the city walls, one could see lines of freshly turned soil stretching into the distance, glinting like scars. The Roman force numbered barely 25,000. Infantry from Anatolia, cavalry from the Balkans, mercenaries from the steppes. They had dug through the night, cursing the heat, but now they stood in ranks behind their handiwork, silent and ready. At dawn, the armies faced one another. For an hour, nothing moved but the wind. Firuz sent a rider forward with a letter mocking the Roman defences and promising that he would bathe in Dara's springs by nightfall. Belisarius replied that he should bring a towel. Then the waiting ended. The Persian line advanced in glittering waves, hooves striking sparks from the baked ground. Trumpets answered across the field, and the Roman horns gave their reply. Long, steady, unhurried. The first charge hit the left flank, a thunder of metal and dust. The trenches did their work. Horses stumbled into the diagonal cuts, fell screaming, broke their legs. Riders plunged after them, and in the confusion, Roman archers on the ridges above released volleys of arrows so dense that the sky seemed to darken. The second wave struck the opposite flank. Belisarius had kept his own cavalry hidden behind a low rise. The Bucellari, his personal guard, men bound to him by oath and pay. At his signal, they swept down in perfect silence, striking the Persians from behind. For a moment, the entire battlefield turned. What had been a charge became a rout. The Roman general, still mounted near the center, gave a single order: halt pursuit. He would not waste men on vanity. When the dust cleared, 8,000 Persians lay dead, and Dara remained in Roman hands. It was the first clear victory the empire had won against Persia in a generation. Word of it reached Constantinople before the wounded did. The emperor, hearing of the trenches, called it a miracle of reason. The court poets called it providence. But those who had seen the battlefield knew it was neither. It was calculation, the mind of a man who understood that geometry could be mightier than faith. Belisarius's name began to move through the empire, like rumor made flesh. Yet his triumph carried the seed of its own trial. A year later, he would face disaster. In 531, along the banks of the Euphrates, the Persians returned. Their king, Kavad, old and cunning, had sent another army to raid the Roman provinces. Belisarius, urged on by overeager subordinates, allowed himself to be drawn into open battle near Callinicum. It was Easter Eve, a day when even soldiers longed for rest. The desert wind cut like flame, and the river glimmered behind them, a silver trap. The enemy struck before noon. The Roman right, held by Arab allies, broke under pressure and fled. Persian lancers poured through the gap, hammering the line inwards. Belisarius tried to rally the infantry, forming them into a shield wall with their backs to the water. For hours they held, fighting knee-deep in corpses until night fell and the survivors slipped across the river under darkness. It was not defeat that wounded Belisarius most, but the knowledge that he had ignored his own caution. Back in Constantinople, whispers spread that the general had lost his nerve. Court rivals sharpened their tongues. Some called for his recall. Justinian hesitated, torn between pride and trust. In the end, he summoned Belisarius home, not to punish him, but to keep him close. The emperor had learned that loyalty was rarer than victory. When Belisarius entered the capital, the streets were lined with silent crowds. They had heard of Dara and Callinicum both, of triumph and humiliation, of the general who could win with numbers half the enemy's and lose with twice their discipline. He rode through them without expression, neither basking nor ashamed. He knew that war was never finished. It only paused between reckonings. In the months that followed, Justinian leaned heavily on his commander's counsel. There were new threats to consider. Revolts in the capital, whispers of heresy, the question of how to rebuild an empire whose edges were fraying faster than gold could mend them. Yet in the private conversations between emperor and general, something took shape. A vision of the world remade. The emperor spoke of reconquest, of Africa, of Italy, of the western lands that had once bowed to Rome. He dreamed of banners flying again over Carthage and the Tiber. Belisarius listened, saying little. He was no dreamer, yet something in him stirred at the thought of bringing order to chaos once more. The empire was old, but its heartbeat had not yet stopped. Dara had proved what a single mind could achieve with discipline and imagination. Callinicum had taught what pride could cost. Between those two lessons lay the measure of Belisarius, the man who would become the last great architect of Rome's wars. For now, the frontier was quiet. The Persians buried their dead. The Romans rebuilt their walls. But beyond the silence, both empires were listening. One waiting to rise again, the other waiting for the next blow. And in the palace, under the high vaults of Hagia Sophia, Justinian was already preparing to strike westward. Eternal in name, the city shook as if the world's last hour had come. Constantinople, jewel of the Roman East, was burning. The winter sky above the Bosporus pulsed red, its light thrown back from the gilded domes and marble colonnades as though the heavens themselves reflected the flames. For 6 days and nights, cries of Nika, victory, rolled through the avenues, echoing across the harbours and into the emperor's palace. But there was no victory, only chaos. What began in the hippodrome as another contest between the blues and greens had become a war within the walls. The factions had long been more than chariot supporters. They were parties of class and creed, their colours marking alliances as powerful as legions. Beneath the roar of horses and the dust of racing wheels lay the pressure of a society stretched thin by taxes, corruption, and hunger. Now, in one convulsion, all those tensions had burst into flame. From his throne in the great palace, Justinian watched his city unravel. He was not yet the lawgiver of legend, but a ruler still learning the reach of his own power. His reforms had angered the Senate. His taxes had enraged the poor. Those who resented him found their moment in the uproar of the circus. Prisoners freed by the mob swelled the streets. Churches burned. The prefect's house was torn apart brick by brick. The imperial guard, outnumbered, surrounded, fell back to the palace gates. Within, there was panic. Ministers whispered of escape, of abandoning the capital and sailing for Asia. The emperor hesitated, the weight of the crown suddenly heavier than iron. For days he had bent before the storm, dismissing hated officials, promising mercy. It had bought him nothing. Now the mob hailed a new emperor, Hypatius, a nephew of Anastasius, old and bewildered, thrust toward a throne he had not sought. Then, in the inner chambers of the palace, a woman rose and ended the argument. Theodora had been silent through hours of trembling debate, watching the men around her falter. When she spoke, her voice was cold and steady, like a drawn sword. "If flight were the only choice," she said, "I would not flee. Royal purple makes a fine shroud." No chronicle could capture what that moment meant. An empress from the theatre, lecturing senators on courage, shaming generals into defiance. Even Justinian, who had commanded armies and outwitted priests, found himself stilled by her certainty. He straightened. Orders were issued. The palace gates were barred. The emperor would not run. Across the gardens, the general Belisarius awaited the signal. Recalled from the Persian front, he had come to the capital expecting ceremony, not civil war. But the chaos outside required a soldier's answer. With him stood Mundus, another veteran of frontier campaigns. Two commanders with everything to lose, and only one command: crush the revolt. The Hippodrome was the heart of the insurrection. Tens of thousands had gathered there, shouting the names of the dead and the new emperor they meant to crown. Fires licked at the adjoining baths and porticos. Smoke blurred the colonnades. The arena that had once echoed with the thunder of chariots now became a cauldron of blood. At dawn, Belisarius led his troops through the side gates. No speech, no ceremony, only the sharp call to arms and the scrape of shields. The narrow entranceways funneled his men inward as the rebels, caught in their own mass, could neither flee nor fight in order. Arrows fell from the stands. Stones rained from the tiers. The general advanced without pause, his face set, his shield raised. His soldiers, Isaurians, Thracians, veterans of Dara, cut through the mob with mechanical precision. Behind them came Mundus with the Imperial Guard, sealing every exit. For an hour, the Hippodrome became a slaughterhouse. When it was done, the chants of Nika had vanished into silence. The sand was black with blood. 30,000 corpses lay piled against the marble barriers. Theodora's shroud had been woven for others. That night, the smoke hung low over the ruined city. The fires had devoured churches, markets, even sections of the old Augusteum. Among the ashes, the emperor walked in silence. He had saved his throne at a terrible cost. The roar of the mob was gone, but the echo of it would never leave his mind. In the days that followed, Justinian rebuilt with the fury of a penitent determined to outdo his sin. The ruins of the Hagia Sophia, destroyed in the riot, became the foundation for something greater. He summoned architects from every province, commanding them to raise a new basilica that would make all others seem like shadows. Its dome, when finished, would seem to float upon light itself, a monument born of ruin. Belisarius, for his part, was silent about the blood he had spilled. The emperor rewarded him richly, but praise sat uneasily on a soldier who had seen what obedience demanded. Yet Justinian had learned something vital in those 6 days of terror, that the general from Thrace would stand fast when all others quailed. That loyalty, bought not with gold but conviction, would be the foundation of every war to come. As the smoke cleared, the emperor looked beyond the Bosporus. He had survived treachery at the heart of his realm. Now he would test the edges of it. To restore the old world, he would first cleanse it of the barbarians who had stolen Rome's western provinces. North Africa, Italy, Spain. The names rose like ghosts in his thoughts. The empire would be made whole again. And there was only one man he trusted to lead the armies of resurrection. Far from the city's ruins, preparations began in secret. Smiths forged new armor. Shipwrights labored in the harbors. Scribes copied orders sealed with the imperial monogram. The general waited for the summons, his face unreadable, his loyalty unquestioned. The empire had been saved by blood. Soon it would be tested by the sea. From the ashes of Constantinople rose a new dream, not of peace, but of restoration. The smoke of the Nika riots had barely faded when Emperor Justinian turned his gaze from the ruins of his capital to the glittering horizon of the Western Sea. The empire had survived rebellion by the sword of Belisarius. Now it would seek redemption through conquest. The idea had haunted the emperor for years, to restore the old dominion, to bind East and West again under one faith and one law. Rome's heart had been broken, its limbs scattered among barbarians who wore its titles and mocked its gods. Yet in Justinian's mind, the empire had never truly fallen. It had only drifted into sleep, waiting for the right hand to awaken it. He spoke not of expansion, but of renewal. To his courtiers, he declared that the campaign would be a work of piety, the cleansing of heresy, the liberation of Christians held under Arian kings. But beneath the hymns and proclamations lay harder truths: wealth, prestige, legitimacy. The empire's coffers had been drained by riots and plague, its authority mocked by frontier kings who had once been Rome's servants. A victory in the West would silence all doubts. The target lay across the Mediterranean, the Vandal kingdom of North Africa, a realm rich in grain, oil, and gold. Founded on conquest, it had become complacent. Its capital, Carthage, stood proud again. But the Vandals were no longer the warriors who had once sacked Rome. They ruled a restless population of Romanized provincials, taxed and humiliated by foreign masters. Their king, Gelimer, had seized the throne by treachery, imprisoning his cousin Hilderic, a monarch who had been Justinian's friend and ally. When word reached the emperor that the deposed king had been blinded and left to die, Justinian found the pretext his ambition required. God does not suffer injustice, he said, and neither shall we. The court murmured in alarm. Ministers warned of disaster. The last Roman armada sent against Carthage had perished in fire and storm. Advisors like John of Cappadocia urged caution, pleading that the treasury could not endure another failure. Justinian listened, then brushed them aside. Fortune, he told them, favors those who trust in providence. For command of the expedition, he chose the man who had already saved his throne, Belisarius, now Magister Militum per Orientem, general of the East. The appointment astonished the court. Many expected an older, more pliable noble, but Justinian understood the measure of his Thracian protégé. Belisarius was brilliant, incorruptible, and, most importantly, loyal. The general accepted the charge without flourish. He knew what it meant to be trusted by an emperor who trusted almost no one. His army was small, barely 15,000 soldiers, a fraction of the force that would normally be sent across an ocean. There were 10,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and a handful of Hun and Heruli mercenaries. With them came his Bucellari, the household troops who had followed him through Persia and fire alike. Their loyalty was to him, but through him, to the empire. The fleet that would bear them west numbered 500 ships, transports, escorts, and supply vessels, a forest of masts that filled the harbors of Constantinople. From the decks rose the smell of pitch and salt. From the quays, the hum of voices speaking in Greek, Latin, Gothic, and every dialect of the East. To see the armada assembled was to glimpse the old imperial dream in flesh and timber. Before departure, the emperor and the general met one last time in the palace. It was said that Justinian's gaze lingered on him a long while, as if trying to read the lines of destiny in the soldier's face. "Bring me back Africa," he said simply, "and God will reward us both." Belisarius bowed, though whether in obedience or foreknowledge, none could say. The armada departed in midsummer, its sails billowing like white wings against the blue. The voyage westward was slow, burdened by heat and superstition. The men feared the open sea, praying not to drown before they had seen battle. In the cramped holds, disease spread easily. At one stopover, hundreds died after eating spoiled bread. The general ordered the guilty quartermasters flogged and spoke sternly to his men. "If we are to win God's favor, we must act as his instruments, not his plunderers. Justice," he said, "is the greatest shield a soldier may bear." The words struck deep. When a pair of drunken Huns murdered a comrade, he had them hanged before the entire army. It was not cruelty, but creed, proof that discipline would be the foundation of victory. At last, after months of coastal voyaging, the ships anchored off Caput Vada in modern Tunisia. The landing was unopposed. The Vandals had not believed the Romans would dare such a gamble. Carthage lay within reach, but Belisarius advanced cautiously, sending scouts ahead and forbidding pillage. The locals, remembering the justice of Rome and weary of Vandal arrogance, watched the newcomers with wary hope. When some soldiers stole from a village, the general had them publicly beaten, then gathered his troops. "The Libyans are our kin," he told them. "Their fathers were Romans before yours were born. If we wrong them, we betray our own blood." The next morning, the market of the nearest town was opened to his army, and the citizens came forth with bread and wine. The conquest had not begun in blood, but in restraint, a weapon rarer than the sword. As the army marched along the coast, the fleet kept pace offshore, its masts gleaming under the sun. Each evening, the soldiers fortified their camp, aware that Gelimer's forces might strike from the desert at any hour. Yet no enemy appeared. The Vandals were divided, one brother in Sardinia, another marching too late to intercept the invaders. Fortune, it seemed, had joined Belisarius's cause. Behind them, Constantinople buzzed with rumor and prayer. Justinian's ministers waited for news, calculating the profit of victory or the ruin of failure. The emperor, pacing the marble corridors of his rebuilt palace, trusted no one but his distant general. Across the African plains, Belisarius's banners advanced slowly toward Carthage. To his men, he appeared unshakable, calm even when scouts reported Vandal riders in the hills, patient when the heat left others gasping. He moved as though the landscape itself obeyed him. At night, he would ride the perimeter of the camp, speaking quietly to sentries. "You hold the empire's breath in your hands," he told one. "If you falter, it stops." Few generals in memory had spoken to common soldiers in that way, and fewer still had meant it. The road curved toward the ruins of ancient cities, Roman columns half buried in sand, inscriptions fading beneath centuries of wind. To the veterans among his ranks, it felt as if the ghosts of old legions marched beside them, guiding them toward a destiny that belonged as much to memory as to men. By early September, they reached the outskirts of Ad Decimum, 10 miles south of Carthage. There, the open plains narrowed between sea and salt marsh, a perfect place for an ambush. The commander paused, sensing danger. His scouts reported dust clouds on the horizon, the first sign that Gelimer's army was finally on the move. The air thickened with the promise of battle. Belisarius ordered the men to rest and fortify, but kept his armor near at hand. He looked westward, toward the setting sun, where Carthage glowed faintly against the horizon. Somewhere beyond that light, an enemy king prepared to meet him. The general turned back toward his camp, toward the soldiers who trusted him utterly. "Tomorrow," he said to his aide, "we will see if the gods still favor Rome." The sea murmured beyond the dunes, carrying the sound of the waves and the whisper of sails far out on the water. The ships that had brought the empire's last great hope to Africa. Morning broke over the African plain in a haze of gold and dust. Belisarius rose before sunrise, his armor already polished, his mind fixed upon the day. The night winds had carried strange sounds, distant hoofbeats, the cries of unseen men, but the camp itself stood silent. Ahead stretched the narrow corridor of Adequimum, 10 miles south of Carthage, where the sea pressed hard upon the salt marshes. A single road ran between them. Whoever held that road would decide the fate of Africa. Gelimer's scouts had watched the Roman march for days. The Vandal king knew his enemies' numbers, barely 15,000, and believed them doomed once cut off from their ships. He had chosen his ambush well. Amatas, his brother, waited on the northern approach to block the road to Carthage. Another, Gibamund, lurked near the inland salt lakes with cavalry ready to sweep in from the flank. Gelimer himself would descend from the hills once the fighting began. If all went to plan, the Romans would be trapped between hammer and anvil, destroyed before they ever glimpsed the city's walls. Belisarius, however, trusted neither silence nor fortune. He halted his column and sent his bucellari forward to scout, ordering the infantry to fortify a temporary camp. The general had learned to listen to the ground as others listened to men. Dust trails on the horizon spoke of unseen movement. A flight of birds, startled inland, revealed what the enemy wished hidden. Somewhere ahead, he sensed, the trap was already sprung. John of Armenia led the vanguard. Riding ahead with 300 cavalry, he encountered Amatas almost by chance. The Vandal prince had arrived too early, his troops straggling behind. In the first clash, chaos ruled. Amatas fought like a cornered animal, striking down a dozen Romans before he fell. His death shattered his small escort, who fled toward Carthage, spreading panic through the reinforcements that followed. Meanwhile, to the west, Gibamund's cavalry advanced through the low dunes, only to meet Belisarius's Hun mercenaries charging from concealment. The desert thundered as the two mounted lines collided. Within moments, the Vandals broke and scattered into the marshes. Farther north, Gelimer rode unaware that both his brothers lay dead. He reached the field at midday, expecting to find victory, and instead found corpses. Overcome by grief, he ordered his men to halt while he buried Amatas with his own hands. It was a fatal mercy. When Belisarius learned that the enemy was hesitating, he seized his chance. Rallying his foederati and bucellari, he struck straight through the center. The charge shattered what remained of Vandal order. Gelimer's troops fled into the hills, leaving the road open. By dawn, the Romans had reached the outskirts of Carthage. The city gates stood closed, its people uncertain whom to trust. For nearly a century, Carthage had lived under Vandal rule, its streets paved with Roman marble, but its heart foreign. Now its citizens peered from balconies and rooftops, waiting to see who would claim them. Belisarius forbade looting, punished every theft, and announced that the army came as liberators, not conquerors. When he entered the city the next morning, the populace poured into the streets with olive branches and songs of welcome. In the palace of the Vandal kings, the general sat upon Gelimer's throne and ate the meal prepared for his enemy. That night, He ordered the fortifications repaired and the harbour chained shut. Discipline, not triumph, guided every act. In Constantinople, the first reports of victory reached the emperor. Justinian ordered thanksgiving in Hagia Sophia and decreed that the new campaign funds, the vast treasure of North Africa, would be consecrated to God's purpose. 100,000 pounds of gold, seized from Carthaginian vaults and Vandal palaces, flooded into the imperial treasury. With that gold, he would rebuild what had been lost, raise armies, and finance the next dream, the reconquest of Italy. But Africa was not yet pacified. News arrived that Gelimer's brother, Zazo, returning from Sardinia with 5,000 veterans, had landed near Carthage. Gelimer rallied what forces remained and advanced to meet him. The final battle would be fought at Tricamarum, a few miles west of the city. Belisarius marched out to meet him. His infantry trailed far behind, and his cavalry reached the field first. Before them lay a shallow river bordered by scrub and stones. Across it, the Vandals formed up in glittering ranks, their spears long, their shields painted with golden suns. Between the two armies stretched a hush as thick as the heat. Belisarius gave the order to advance. The first charge crashed against the Vandal line and fell back. A second met the same fate. The third, led by John of Armenia, drove straight into the center where Zazo fought beside his king. Arrows hissed, shields splintered, and the Vandal standard wavered. When Zazo fell, pierced through the throat, his men faltered. Gelimer tried to rally them, but despair moved faster than orders. The line dissolved. The Vandals fled. By nightfall, their camp was overrun. Roman soldiers found wagons piled with treasures looted generations earlier from Rome itself. The golden menorah from Jerusalem, imperial regalia once borne in triumph through the Forum. Belisarius ordered everything catalogued, not plundered. "These are not ours," he told his officers, "but Rome's." The words carried through the ranks like a benediction. Carthage greeted its new masters with torches and music. The people feasted in the streets. Temples long closed to the Orthodox were reopened. Even the sea seemed to glow with reflected firelight. Yet Belisarius allowed himself no celebration. He knew Africa's conquest was fragile, built upon discipline and rumor. Gelimer had fled into the mountains, and Berber tribes still raided the frontier. The general dispatched detachments to secure the countryside, then sent the Heruli commander Pharas after the fugitive king. For 3 months, Pharas laid siege to Gelimer's refuge. When hunger and cold overcame royal pride, the Vandal king surrendered. He was promised life, safety, and the mercy of his conqueror. In spring of the following year, Belisarius boarded ship for home. His holds overflowed with prisoners, treasures, and trophies, the spoils of a kingdom erased in half a year. His officers warned him that jealous tongues in Constantinople whispered treason, that he planned to found his own empire in Africa. Belisarius merely smiled. "An empire belongs to him who can hold it," he said. "I hold nothing but my loyalty." When his fleet entered the Golden Horn, the city erupted in welcome. No general since the days of the Caesars had returned with such triumph. Justinian himself came forth to greet him, and together they led the procession through streets hung with garlands and banners. Behind them rolled wagons heaped with captured gold. Behind the gold walked King Gelimer in chains, murmuring words from Ecclesiastes, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." For this victory, the emperor granted Belisarius the rare honor of a triumph, the first in 500 years bestowed upon a man not born to the purple. He rode in his chariot through cheering crowds as the trumpets sounded and the banners of Rome unfurled in the wind. But his eyes, witnesses said, were grave, not proud. He knew how swiftly favor turned to envy in the palace of Constantinople. That night, from the windows of his house overlooking the Bosporus, he watched the lights of the city reflected in the water. Somewhere beyond that glittering darkness lay new wars waiting to be fought. Italy, Persia, the endless frontiers of empire. The Vandal kingdom was gone, but its treasure would fund every dream that followed, and every disaster. For the moment, the empire stood renewed. The old banners of Rome had flown again over Africa. Yet even as the cheers faded into the sea wind, Belisarius felt the truth that no emperor would ever confess. Victory is not the end of war, only its disguise. Triumph is a brief season in Constantinople. Applause fades faster than incense smoke, and praise soon curdles into fear. When Belisarius returned from Africa, crowned with glory, the emperor embraced him before the people, calling him defender of the faith and restorer of the West. But within the marble corridors of the palace, other voices whispered. Success in an empire ruled by suspicion was the most dangerous kind of loyalty. The general's procession had ended with the spoils of a vanished kingdom. Wagons piled with gold, captives in chains, relics once plundered from the temples of Jerusalem and the treasuries of Rome. The sight dazzled the city. Senators spoke of a second Scipio. Priests declared the hand of Providence made visible. Yet, behind the celebration, Theodora watched in silence, her eyes unreadable. To her, glory was a fleeting mask for ambition, and she distrusted all masks. Belisarius's wife, Antonina, stood beside her in that same procession, confidant, ally, and spy. She had risen from the same rough stages that once held Theodora, and between the two women ran an invisible cord of kinship and rivalry. Antonina adored her husband, yet thrived in the coils of court politics. Through her, Theodora kept her pulse on the general's household, ensuring that no triumph bred treachery. In the first months after his return, Belisarius was feted endlessly. The emperor held audiences in his honor. Poets compared him to heroes of antiquity, and the people shouted his name from the hippodrome seats. Yet beneath the applause lurked the question that no one dared voice. Had he grown too beloved? The gold from Africa, a staggering £100,000, now filled the imperial vaults, funding new fortresses, public works, and the rebuilding of the Hagia Sophia. It also funded envy. Ministers who had opposed the African war now claimed its credit. Those who had warned of disaster whispered that victory had been too complete to be innocent. At court, nothing was ever forgotten. The same emperor who could trust Belisarius with his throne still kept him near, not as reward, but as precaution. He was promoted to consul, a title that had once ruled the Republic and now served as a ceremonial honor, and given the privilege of scattering coins to the crowds in celebration. Gold rained upon the hippodrome, and the people shouted his name once more. But Belisarius felt the chill beneath the cheers. Coins, like power, fall quickly and are forgotten. He asked leave to return to the frontier, where swords were cleaner than tongues. Justinian refused. "Rest," he said. "There will be work soon enough." The words were promise and warning both. For even as the empire rejoiced in Africa's return, Justinian's mind had already turned north and west toward Italy, where the Gothic kingdom stood like a broken mirror of the Roman past. There, the descendants of Theodoric the Great had begun to devour one another. The regent Amalasuntha, learned daughter of Theodoric, had ruled wisely after her father's death, maintaining uneasy friendship with Constantinople. But when she was murdered, strangled in her bath by men acting in her cousin Theodahad's name, the emperor saw his pretext. The blood of our ally cries for justice, he declared. To avenge her and to reclaim Italy would be a single holy act. The plan demanded boldness and subtlety in equal measure. The war in Africa had been swift and surgical, but Italy would be different, larger, older, more divided. To command such a campaign required a general who could win hearts as well as cities. Yet the emperor hesitated. To send Belisarius again would invite envy and dread. To entrust another risked failure. The court divided. Theodora, wary of his rising legend, urged caution. Justinian, drawn by the same brilliance that once saved his reign, chose trust again, though less freely than before. Meanwhile, Belisarius endured the strange peace of idleness. He kept his household disciplined, drilled his troops, and waited. When courtiers flattered him, he answered with silence. When rivals insulted him, he bowed. But even patience has its edges. He had tasted command over nations and could not return to mere ceremony. Only Antonina seemed at ease in this suspended world, whispering in the salons of the capital, weaving alliances from gossip. Her friendship with Theodora shielded her husband as much as it bound him. Far from the city, along the Danube and the Euphrates, new rumors of war began to rise. Huns raided the Balkans. Persian envoys demanded tribute. The emperor's treasury, though swollen by African gold, poured silver faster than it could collect it. Justinian's ambitions outran his resources, yet ambition was the breath of his reign. When he spoke of rebuilding the empire, he did not mean mere walls. He meant eternity. One winter evening, as mist rolled in from the sea, Belisarius was summoned to the palace. The emperor greeted him with uncharacteristic warmth. "Africa is secure," Justinian said. "The Vandals are dust. The sea is ours. But the true crown of Rome lies still in foreign hands. Italy waits for her deliverer." He paused, studying the man who stood before him in silence. "Will you be that hand again?" Belisarius did not kneel. He bowed his head slightly, the gesture of one soldier to another. "If it is your will, Majesty." "Not my will," Justinian answered. "God's." Outside, the bells of the Hagia Sophia tolled vespers across the darkening harbor. The empire's great experiment, to resurrect its ancient self, was about to enter its second act. When Belisarius left the audience, Antonina waited in the torchlit courtyard. She asked no questions. She could read the truth in his face. Soon they would sail again, this time not toward the sands of Africa, but to the mountains and ruined cities of Italy. As they walked together toward their villa, the city lay hushed behind them, its domes glowing faintly through the mist. Within the palace, courtiers already debated how long the general's fortune could last. In the narrow alleys, the people spoke his name with reverence. In the council chamber, with fear. Theodora listened, expressionless. Power, she knew, never loved the man who wielded it too well. Yet Justinian's faith in him held, for now. Beyond the sea, Gothic Italy simmered in confusion, its kings at war, its nobles divided, its people restless beneath a foreign crown. Opportunity and peril intertwined there like serpents. The emperor would send his most brilliant servant to untangle them. When Belisarius looked out across the water from the terrace of his home, the horizon seemed to shimmer with invitation. He thought of the long road from Thrace to Persia, from Dara to Carthage, of the victories that had brought him both glory and solitude. Behind him lay the envy of the palace. Before him, the promise of another war. Suspicion had grown like ivy around his fame, but ivy cannot kill stone. The empire still needed him, and he, though weary of intrigue, still belonged to war. The winter sea was calm when the fleet left Constantinople, but the omen of quiet waters rarely meant peace. 15,000 men sailed for Italy, bearing the burden of an emperor's vision and the doubt of his court. The expedition that would decide the fate of the West crossed a sea that had once been a Roman lake, now a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. From their decks, the soldiers watched islands rise from mist and vanish again, stepping stones toward the ghost of empire. Belisarius led the armada with the same calm precision that had broken the Vandals in Africa. His wife, Antonina, was again at his side. Her presence at headquarters raised whispers, but the general did not heed them. He had learned that loyalty in war was measured not in speeches, but in endurance. The emperor's orders were simple: occupy Sicily, test Gothic resistance, and if the gods favored Rome, strike the Italian mainland. Sicily fell with scarcely a wound. The island's cities, long Roman in tongue and faith, opened their gates one after another. Only Palermo resisted. Its defenders fought from towers with desperation, but Belisarius's engineers raised timber ramps higher than the walls themselves, pushing siege towers forward until the Goths yielded. The general forbade pillage. When the city surrendered, he walked its streets unarmed, speaking with priests and merchants alike. "We have come," he told them, "not to conquer, but to return." The words spread faster than his banners. By the end of the year, the island was his. In Constantinople, Justinian accepted the news as confirmation of divine favor. The emperor's letters praised his generals' swift and bloodless victories, though some courtiers noted that the emperor's tone contained both admiration and warning. For men who win too easily may also rise too high. Belisarius's next target lay across the narrow strait at Rhegium, where Italy itself seemed to beckon. The Gothic kingdom, once ruled by the mighty Theodoric, had decayed under his feeble heirs. The philosopher-warrior who had united Italy beneath a vision of Roman order was gone. In his place stood kings who mistrusted their subjects and each other. After the murder of Amalasuntha, chaos reigned. The current ruler, Theodahad, cared more for gold and astrology than for governance. When word reached him that Roman sails had appeared off the southern coast, he sent only letters of protest and omens predicting disaster. The landing in Italy met no resistance. Towns that had suffered Gothic neglect welcomed Belisarius as a deliverer. He advanced north with his usual caution, taking stock of terrain and temperament alike. Where the Goths had neglected roads, his engineers rebuilt them. Where supplies were scarce, he ordered local markets reopened under protection. The army moved not as invaders, but as a disciplined procession, each step reinforcing the illusion that Rome had merely returned from exile. The first true obstacle awaited him at Naples. Perched on volcanic slopes above the sea, the city was garrisoned by a few hundred Gothic soldiers and a population divided between fear and hope. Belisarius sent envoys offering generous terms: freedom of worship, protection of property, and Roman citizenship restored. The citizens wavered. The Gothic commander urged resistance, claiming that reinforcements from the north would soon arrive. At last, the city refused surrender. The general, regretting what must follow, ordered the siege begun. Naples proved a torment. The walls were ancient, strong, and narrow streets within made any assault perilous. Weeks passed in grinding stalemate. Belisarius walked the lines daily, listening to reports, speaking softly to the weary and wounded. The summer heat brought disease. Supplies dwindled. Then one of his engineers, examining an ancient aqueduct that entered the city through the cliffs, made a suggestion. Belisarius studied the channel himself, tracing its course beneath the rock. Within hours he had his plan, to send picked men through the aqueduct at night, while feigning an assault at the walls. On a moonless evening, 100 volunteers crept into the conduit, moving through darkness and water until they reached the cistern beneath the city. When they emerged into the streets, horns sounded from outside. The defenders, rushing to the walls, found Roman troops already among them. Gates were forced open. Fighting raged from tower to market square. By dawn, the city was taken. Belisarius rode in at sunrise, his armor splashed with blood and dust, his face expressionless. He forbade slaughter, striking down a soldier who raised his sword against a civilian. "The war is against kings," he said, "not against Romans." News of Naples's fall swept through Italy. Theodahad, dismayed, sought astrologers for comfort and found none. His subjects began to desert him. In Ravenna, the Gothic court muttered of replacing a scholar with a soldier. Before the year's end, they deposed him and proclaimed Witiges king, a man of courage and age who had once served under Theodoric himself. His first act was to gather a vast army and march south to crush the Romans before they reached the Tiber. Belisarius, unaware of the storm forming beyond the Apennines, paused to secure his gains. He repaired Naples's walls, treated its wounds, and paid for bread out of his own purse to feed the poor. Soldiers and citizens alike began to see him not merely as a conqueror, but as a man touched by the old Roman virtue of pietas. Even enemies would later admit that his justice bound men more surely than chains. By late autumn, he prepared for the advance on Rome itself. Scouts brought reports of the road ahead. Its milestones cracked, its bridges half collapsed, its villages stripped bare by Gothic requisitions. The eternal city, once heart of the world, had become a hollow relic, its population a fraction of the past. Yet the name still carried a magic weight. Rome is not a city, he told his officers, but a memory we are commanded to defend. At dawn, the army crossed the old Via Latina. Behind them, the smoke of Naples still hung over the horizon. Ahead lay the long road north. Mules carried grain, smiths followed with forges, scribes marched among soldiers, recording each town's submission. It was less an invasion than a pilgrimage. Along the route, peasants knelt beside the road, holding out bread and salt. Some wept. For generations they had been subjects of kings who called themselves Romans, but ruled as strangers. Now they believed. The empire itself had returned to claim them. Belisarius rode at the head of the column, his cloak stained with travel, his thoughts already reaching beyond victory. He knew that Italy would not be won by one siege or a single battle. The Gothic War would test endurance, loyalty, and the fragile bond between soldier and sovereign. Behind his calm eyes lay calculation, how to hold what he conquered, how to keep the emperor's faith while surviving his suspicion. The road to Rome stretched ahead, broken and eternal. Somewhere beyond the hills, Witiges' armies were gathering, and the ancient walls waited to see which empire would claim them next. As the sun set behind Mount Vesuvius, Belisarius turned in his saddle to watch the last light fade from the bay. "So begins the harder task," he murmured. The sea breeze carried his words away toward the west, where the ruins of empire glimmered like stars waiting to be rekindled. Italy felt winter's return, harsh and personal, like the visit of a former adversary. The mountains were white with silence, and the valleys smelled of smoke and wet stone. Into that frozen country marched Belisarius, leading his army north from Naples toward a city whose very name could still command the world's breath. Rome lay ahead, diminished, divided, and waiting for deliverance. It was December when the army reached the outskirts. The Gothic garrison, fearing the legend more than the man, abandoned the gates and slipped away at night. When dawn came, the general rode through the Porta Asinaria unopposed. The people poured from their houses, weeping, carrying olive branches, blessing the soldier who had brought the eagle's standard home. After 60 years of exile under barbarian kings, the Eternal City was Roman once more. Belisarius dismounted before the Lateran Basilica, bowed his head, and prayed. "Let this house endure," he said, "though kingdoms fall." He sent word to Justinian. Rome is restored to the empire. The emperor's reply, when it came weeks later, was measured, as though glory, once achieved, had already become a political inconvenience. Yet for that moment, even envy could not dim the miracle. The miracle, however, was fragile. The new Gothic king Witiges had assembled a vast army in the north. Men hardened by years of frontier war, enraged by their capital's loss. Before the winter was over, they marched south, 30,000 strong, to retake what the Romans had won. By the time the first Gothic scouts appeared beyond the walls, Belisarius commanded fewer than 7,000 soldiers, a handful of cavalry, worn infantry, and local levies armed with hope. Rome herself was a shadow of the empire she once ruled. Her population, once 500,000, had dwindled to 1/10 of that. The great baths stood dry, the forum grass-grown, and the Senate a hollow name. Yet her walls still encircled the memory of power. 12 miles of crumbling masonry and towers, impossible to defend fully, impossible to abandon. Belisarius resolved to hold them. He walked the perimeter himself, studying every gate, every fallen arch. Masons repaired breaches with rubble and lime. He ordered merlons built along the battlements, deep trenches dug before the weakest sectors, and granaries filled to bursting. Even the city's fountains were repurposed. Their cisterns became water stores for the siege to come. When the citizens complained of fatigue, he worked beside them, hauling stones with his own hands. "Rome endures," he said. "Therefore, so must we." Witiges's army appeared in March. From the northern hills, their campfires stretched across the horizon like a necklace of red stars. They built 7 fortified camps, cutting the aqueducts that had fed the city for 800 years. The Goths thought to dry Rome into surrender, but Belisarius turned calamity into invention. Engineers rechanneled the broken watercourses to power mills along the Tiber, grinding grain for the garrison and people alike. What the enemy had destroyed, he transformed into life. The siege began in earnest. The Goths assaulted from the north, their heavy infantry pushing siege towers toward the walls. Oxen dragged the machines forward until Roman arrows cut them down. Belisarius on horseback rode along the parapets, shouting orders, loosing arrows himself. At the mausoleum of Hadrian, now a fortress, stones and statues were hurled down upon the attackers until the river ran red. After 3 days of fighting, the Goths withdrew. The city rejoiced, lighting fires upon the walls, singing hymns that mingled with the smell of smoke and blood. Victory bred endurance, but hunger soon returned. With the aqueducts severed, the baths lay cold, and disease crept through the streets. Corpses were buried in gardens. Grain grew scarce. Belisarius rationed food strictly, refusing privilege even for officers. "A general must hunger first," he said, eating once a day beside his men. When merchants risked the sea to bring grain from Sicily, He welcomed them as heroes and paid double the price. For months, the city clung to survival by the will of one man. Through it all, his discipline remained iron. When rumors arose that the Pope, Silverius, had opened secret negotiations with the Goths, Antonina confronted him in person. "My husband defends your city," she said coldly. "You will not betray it." The pontiff was sent into honorable exile, an act that would stain Belisarius's name among churchmen, but save Rome itself. In autumn, reinforcements finally arrived from the east, a mere 1,500 cavalry, mostly Huns and Slavs, but their presence revived the defenders. The general unleashed a new strategy: hit-and-run warfare beyond the gates. His mounted archers darted out to harass the besiegers, striking camps and foraging parties, then vanishing behind the walls before counterattack. Over 60 skirmishes were fought in this way, none decisive, but all demoralizing. The Goths began to fear every movement of dust along the ramparts. Then came winter's cruelty. Flooding ruined the Gothic supply lines. Disease struck their camps. The besiegers starved while Rome endured. By spring, after more than a year, Witiges offered a truce. He would yield southern Italy if the emperor would recognize his rule in the north. Justinian refused. Instead, he sent orders to Belisarius: "Press the advantage." The general obeyed. He dispatched a cavalry detachment north under his subordinate John, whose raids through Picenum tore through unguarded towns and farms, severing the Gothic army from its homeland. When the news reached Witiges, panic broke what hunger had begun. The Gothic king lifted the siege, retreating north toward Ravenna. The Roman banners flew once more above every gate. When the last Gothic camp lay empty, Belisarius walked the walls alone. Below him, the fields were strewn with abandoned engines, broken ladders, and bones. The air was quiet except for the turning of the river wheels that ground the city's grain. Those same mills born of ruin. He thought of the old republic, of Caesar and Trajan, of victories won and forgotten. Then he descended to the forum, where a handful of citizens waited to thank him. Their words faltered. They looked upon him as men might look upon a figure from marble come to life. Rome had been saved, but at a cost that could not be measured in lives or walls. The city was hollowed, the empire stretched thin, and the man who had restored it stood already, half alone, in his triumph. Letters of praise came from Constantinople, gilded with promises. Yet beneath the imperial blessing, Belisarius sensed unease, the kind that follows miracles. He had defended the ancient capital with fewer men than guarded the emperor's palace, and he had done it through reason, not providence. Such brilliance casts long shadows. That spring, as the first green returned to the hills, Belisarius ordered prayers of thanksgiving in every church. He knew the peace would not last. Ravenna still held the Gothic crown. The war was far from over. But for one brief moment, the city that had once ruled the world stood free again, alive on the strength of one general's faith in his craft. The mills turned on the Tiber, grinding grain for the hungry. Water that had once served pleasure now served survival. In that rhythmic sound, Belisarius heard the truth of empire. It endured not by splendor but by ingenuity, not by monuments but by the mind that refused to yield. Spring brought little rest to Italy. The fields outside Rome were still scarred by siege engines and graves when Belisarius called his officers to the basilica that served as his headquarters. The victory over the Goths had been miraculous, yet he knew that miracles seldom repeated themselves. If the war were to end, it must be ended completely. In Ravenna, the Gothic capital, seat of kings who claimed to be heirs of Rome. Reports from scouts spoke of retreat, of Gothic armies in disarray, of cities that opened their gates as soon as they saw the Roman eagle. The general listened without triumph. He had learned that victory, like rumor, could turn false overnight. "Until the king kneels," he said, "we have won nothing." The army began its march north along the Via Flaminia, the old road of legions. Each step was a journey through the ruins of empire. Shattered bridges, temples turned to barns, marble statues blackened by smoke. In every town, the people came out to greet their deliverers, bearing bread and wine, calling Belisarius liberator and consul. He received their blessings with a soldier's humility and moved on. War, not ceremony, was his vocation. King Witiges, meanwhile, had fallen back upon Ravenna, trusting the city's lagoons and marshes to serve as walls. He had once been a soldier of reputation, but defeat and exile had aged him. His messengers carried desperate appeals to the Franks, to the Persians, even to Constantinople itself, offering tribute for peace. Justinian ignored them. The emperor wanted not treaties, but triumphs. Only total victory could justify the cost of his wars. The campaign that followed was long and cruel. The Romans besieged the fortified towns that guarded Ravenna's approaches, Faesulae, Oximum, and Urbino, one by one. Starvation became their weapon. Belisarius forbade indiscriminate slaughter. Instead, he cut off supply lines, letting hunger and fear do the work of siege towers. In the hills of Tuscany, entire Gothic garrisons surrendered, gaunt and silent, their armor hanging loose upon their bodies. Each victory cost the army more in patience than in blood. By 539, the roads between Rome and the Adriatic lay open. Yet in the Roman camp, tension brewed like storm clouds. A new arrival had upset the delicate hierarchy. Narses, the emperor's chamberlain, sent to supervise the Italian campaign and report directly to Justinian. He was a eunuch, a courtier by birth, but one with ambition as sharp as any blade. His presence turned strategy into politics. Belisarius and Narses were opposites in everything but intellect. One a soldier forged by necessity, the other a tactician of influence. Their correspondence with the emperor became a contest of persuasion. Officers whispered of divisions in command. Some obeyed the general, others the courtier. In councils of war, decisions were made by argument rather than authority. Once, during a debate over whether to relieve a besieged garrison, the two men resorted to a vote. The empire's armies, veterans of 1,000 years, now decided tactics by ballot. Disunity invited disaster. In the north, the city of Milan, recently recovered by the Romans, was surrounded by a joint army of Goths and Burgundians. Its citizens sent desperate appeals for aid. Belisarius urged immediate relief. Narses hesitated, citing supply shortages and omens. When help finally came, it was too late. Milan was stormed, its men butchered, its women sold into slavery. The burning of that city was the price of divided command. When news reached Constantinople, Justinian recalled Narses, unwilling to lose Italy to pride. Belisarius once more stood alone at the head of the army, but victory had been poisoned. The war's moral simplicity, civilization against barbarism, order against chaos, had blurred. Famine stalked the land. Peasants fled their fields, leaving harvests to rot. Soldiers requisitioned grain at sword point, while Gothic partisans harried Roman supply lines. Even success had begun to taste of ash. Still, the general advanced. Oximum fell first, then Faesulae. Each surrender brought him closer to Ravenna, where Witiges, cornered and desperate, sent envoys once more. Their proposal stunned both sides. They offered to make Belisarius emperor of the West if he would turn against Justinian and rule Italy in partnership with them. It was a moment heavy with peril. The offer, though treasonous, was logical. Who else could rule the peninsula but the man who had conquered it? Even Belisarius's closest aides feared he might be tempted. For days he gave no answer. At last he told the Gothic envoys what they wished to hear. "Tell your king," he said, "that I will accept his crown." Ravenna's gates opened without resistance. The Gothic army, believing itself saved, laid down its arms. Belisarius entered the city as if to claim a throne. Banners unfurled, trumpets sounding, the populace hailing him Augustus. He rode straight to the royal palace, received Witiges with solemn courtesy, and ordered that the city be secured in the emperor's name. Then he turned to his officers and said quietly, "No man shall speak of crowns again." The deception was complete. Within hours, the Gothic nobles realized the truth. They were captives, not allies. Their soldiers were dispersed to distant garrisons, their treasury seized. Witiges himself was escorted under guard to Constantinople, where Justinian received him as both guest and prisoner. The emperor smiled for the chroniclers, praising his general's loyalty. Yet behind the smile, a shadow lingered. A man capable of such cunning could never again be wholly trusted. In the capital, celebrations rivaled those that had followed the African War. Ravenna's surrender marked the apparent restoration of the Western Empire. For a brief moment, the Roman world was whole again. From the shores of the Atlantic to the sands of Mesopotamia. But beneath the hymns and processions, the cost was evident. Italy lay ravaged, its cities half ruined, its people scattered. The triumph was built upon ashes. When the ceremony of thanksgiving ended, Belisarius stood in the vast nave of Hagia Sophia, the golden dome blazing above him. He thought of the men buried in foreign soil, of cities reduced to hunger, of the lie that had won him victory. His emperor had gained an empire. He had gained only silence. Soon after, he was ordered eastward again. The Persian frontier flared once more, and Justinian could not afford idleness in so formidable a servant. Belisarius obeyed without complaint. He left Italy as he had found it, divided, weary, waiting for another war. As his ship passed through the Bosporus, the city's lights shimmered on the water like reflections of old victories. He turned away from them. Behind him, in the palaces of Ravenna, his name was already being spoken with both reverence and fear. Ahead lay another frontier, another test, another empire to defend. He had delivered a crown and refused it. Yet even loyalty, when flawless, can cut like treason. The triumphs of Italy had barely faded when word reached Constantinople that the eastern frontier was burning again. The Sassanid king Khosrow, newly crowned and impatient to prove himself, had crossed the Euphrates with a host the chroniclers numbered in tens of thousands. Cities fell before him like dry leaves before a wind. Antioch, jewel of the East, was sacked and its people slaughtered or enslaved. For the first time in living memory, the Persian banners touched the Mediterranean. It was a humiliation the empire could not ignore. The emperor turned, as he always did, to the one man whose presence steadied every crisis. Belisarius, recalled from Italy in triumph, was ordered to Syria with what troops he could gather. But this time, his resources were meager. The wars in the West had drained the treasury, and plague had thinned the ranks. The army he inherited was a shadow of the force that had conquered Africa and Italy, disorganized, ill-paid, and wary of a new campaign. Still, he accepted command without complaint. "If God preserves us," he said, We shall do what men can. He arrived at Dara, the same fortress where a decade earlier he had first carved his name in history. Its walls still bore the scars of that earlier victory, the angled trenches long filled in, but the legend of them unforgotten. From these ramparts he surveyed a frontier stripped bare by panic. Villages lay abandoned, caravan routes were silent. The Persians had not come merely to raid, but to humiliate, to show that Rome's glories in the west meant nothing in the east. Belisarius gathered what strength he could, a mix of frontier troops, mercenaries, and his own bushellari, the loyal veterans who still followed him. He reorganized the ranks, restored discipline, and drilled them until they moved as one. His camp became a mirror of order amid the wilderness. When an officer asked how such few could face an army, the general answered, "With sense." For him, discipline was force multiplied by understanding. Meanwhile, Khosrau advanced through northern Mesopotamia, boasting that he would march as far as Constantinople. The rumor terrified the court, but Belisarius saw the flaw in such arrogance. The Persian supply lines stretched across burning plains, their cavalry scattered in pursuit of plunder. Instead of confronting the invaders directly, he shadowed them, harassing their foragers, intercepting their messengers, making the great host feel small. Then, when Khosrau turned toward the fortress city of Nisibis, Belisarius made his stand nearby, not to fight, but to show resolve. He built his camp deliberately within sight of the Persian walls, knowing the enemy would interpret the gesture as challenge. For days, both sides watched each other. Scouts clashed, arrows darkened the air, but the full battle never came. The Persian commander Nabidus, uncertain of the general's strength, hesitated. Then a local skirmish nearly undid everything. A rash Roman officer, disobeying orders, advanced too near and was cut to pieces. His men broke, the Persians pursued, and Belisarius rode out himself to halt the rout. He turned his cavalry back upon the pursuers, cutting them down with the precision of a surgeon correcting a wound. Order restored, he withdrew before the enemy could regroup. To Khosrau, this restraint was more unnerving than defeat. His scouts reported an army that never slept, a general who appeared everywhere at once, striking and vanishing before response. When he learned that Roman reinforcements were gathering in the south, the Persian king decided that plunder was not worth annihilation. He withdrew across the frontier, taking with him tens of thousands of captives, but leaving the empire intact. Justinian hailed the withdrawal as victory and ordered thanksgiving prayers throughout the provinces. Belisarius, less deceived, saw it for what it was, a reprieve, not a triumph. The frontier remained vulnerable, the army exhausted. He wrote to the emperor, begging for supplies and reinforcements. What arrived instead was an envoy bearing gold for bribes and instructions to negotiate peace if possible. The emperor had begun to tire of costly wars. His general had not. In 541, Belisarius returned briefly to Constantinople. The city glittered as ever, its domes untroubled by the suffering of the frontiers. But the air felt different, thick with rumors of sickness spreading from the Egyptian ports. The general dismissed them at first. War had accustomed him to tales of death. He could not yet imagine the plague that was about to fall upon the world. By spring, the pestilence had reached the capital. It struck without pattern, without mercy. Men collapsed in the streets, their skin darkened with swelling. Others screamed and ran mad before falling silent. The dead were too many to bury. Pits filled faster than they could be dug. Chroniclers would later count between 5,000 and 10,000 deaths a day in Constantinople alone. The emperor himself fell ill, and the empire held its breath. Belisarius, tending the defense of the capital and the remnants of his army, was not spared. Fever took him, and for days he lay between life and death, raving of sieges and ghosts. When he recovered, he found half his household gone. The streets outside were silent except for the wheels of carts carrying the dead to the sea. "The world," he said quietly, "has joined the war against us." The plague changed everything. Armies withered, revenues collapsed, and faith itself seemed to falter. The empire's manpower never recovered. For Justinian, it was a wound that no law or edict could heal. For Belisarius, it was the beginning of a long defeat, measured not in battles, but in absence. When the worst had passed, he returned once more to the eastern provinces, gathering survivors from a dozen garrisons to hold what could still be held. Yet something in him had shifted. The confidence that had once marked his every campaign was tempered by grief. He fought not to win glory, but to prevent collapse, improvising diplomacy where arms failed. When Khosrau raided again, Belisarius bluffed him into retreat, with a show of strength he did not possess. Ranks of horsemen padded by shadows and dust. The Persian scouts, deceived, reported legions that no longer existed. Once again, cunning replaced numbers. At year's end, when peace was finally negotiated, it owed less to the emperor's gold than to the reputation of a general whom even the enemy had learned to fear. Belisarius returned to his camp at Dara Herm to find it half empty, the survivors gaunt but loyal. He walked among them as he had a decade before, yet the world had changed. The plague had stolen more soldiers than any war, and even victory felt like postponement. From the east came rumors of new tribes moving through the steppe, from the west of famine in Italy. The empire, vast and weary, groaned beneath the weight of its own salvation. Belisarius wrote one final report to the emperor. "The borders hold, but the strength of men holds less." Then he sealed the letter and turned back to his duties. In the empire's darkest hour, he had once more done what was asked of him, held the line while the world collapsed around it. Yet for the first time, he sensed that endurance itself might not be enough. Rome could rebuild cities, but not the lives lost to plague. No general, however skilled, could outwit death. The soldier who had conquered Africa and Italy, who had defeated Persia and rebellion alike, now faced an enemy that cared nothing for courage or cunning. Even victory could not restore what the pestilence had taken, and in the haunted silence that followed, the man who had been Rome's last great hope felt the first cold breath of his own mortality. When the pestilence loosened its grip, Constantinople emerged like a city resurrected, still standing but altered in soul. Streets once loud with merchants were hushed. Gardens overran the courtyards of the dead. Survivors spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the silence left by those who had vanished. The empire, though unbroken, had become a mirror of its ruler's haunted endurance. Belisarius returned to the capital in this uneasy calm. The emperor, recovered from illness, but changed by it, received his general with a show of affection that fooled no one. Both men had outlived too much to believe in gratitude. The plague had thinned their world, ministers gone, soldiers dead, fortunes lost, and into that emptiness crept the courtiers who thrived on suspicion. Rumors spread like another contagion. Some claimed the general had grown too wealthy from his wars, that his victories had filled his own coffers as much as the imperial treasury. Others whispered of arrogance, of soldiers who named him emperor in all but crown. Such talk pleased Theodora, who trusted no man whose loyalty outshone his ambition. Her spies, many of them women once indebted to her, lingered in Antonina's circle, carrying fragments of gossip to the palace. The empress ruled the court with silken cruelty. Even Justinian deferred to her judgment in matters of intrigue. She remembered every slight, real or imagined, and had learned to turn jealousy into policy. Belisarius, though respectful, had never flattered her. And Antonina's friendship, equal parts alliance and dependence, could not always shield him. When a petty official accused the general of embezzlement, Theodora did not believe it, but neither did she dismiss it. A shadow on reputation was as useful as a chain. The general endured this slow campaign of distrust with the patience that had won him sieges. He attended ceremonies, offered advice when asked, and spoke rarely in public. His household, once vibrant with soldiers and scholars, grew quiet. Theodora reduced his stipend, and his veterans were reassigned to other commanders. Even the Bucellari, the private guards who had followed him from Persia to Italy, were scattered. The emperor, one courtier murmured, has found it safer to divide his victories than his enemies. While the capital drowned itself in rumor, Italy began to burn again. The Gothic War, thought finished with the fall of Ravenna, had rekindled under a new and younger king. Totila, a soldier of modest birth and fierce charisma, had united the remnants of his people. His vision was not revenge, but renewal, an Italian kingdom built upon discipline and justice. In less than a year, he had retaken city after city, driving the imperial garrisons south. Rome itself was under threat. Belisarius read these reports in silence. He understood what they meant. All that had been won through blood and cunning was unraveling, not by the sword, but by neglect. He petitioned Justinian for reinforcements, warning that the Gothic revival would soon engulf the peninsula. The emperor hesitated. His treasury, drained by plague and rebuilding, could not sustain another massive campaign. Theodora, weary of the general's fame, advised delay. "Let others prove their worth," she said. Months passed before the summons came. When it did, it was couched in formality, a command without enthusiasm. Belisarius was to return to Italy with what forces he could raise privately to restore imperial order. The command was both honor and insult. The emperor offered neither funds nor soldiers, only his blessing. The general was expected to finance the war himself. "If I am to fight," he told Antonina, "it will be with ghosts." He departed quietly, his household diminished, his ships few. Constantinople watched him go without cheers. Those who had once hailed him now looked upon him with a mixture of pity and relief. A hero, after all, was safest when distant. During the voyage west, storms scattered the fleet. When Belisarius finally landed at Salona, he counted no more than 4,000 men. His new enemy, Totila, commanded 6 times that number. 25,000 Gothic warriors hardened by years of retreat and vengeance. The disparity was so absurd that even his officers begged him to refuse the campaign. "We have beaten odds before," he said simply. "We will do so again or die, attempting." Italy, when he reached it, was a graveyard of empires. The cities once conquered by Rome's legions now lay in ruins from wars between Romans themselves. Famine stalked the countryside. The Tiber carried more corpses than boats. The people greeted the returning general without joy, not from hostility, but exhaustion. They had seen too many saviors come and go. Belisarius established his headquarters at Ravenna, the same city whose gates had opened to him years before. Its mosaics still glittered, but its streets were half empty. From here, he began the impossible: to defend an empire with an army smaller than a single Gothic column. He fortified the ports, drilled the recruits, and sent pleas for aid that met only silence. "The emperor," he wrote bitterly to a friend, "has given me war without soldiers, glory without means." Letters from Antonina grew infrequent. She had remained in Constantinople to act as his advocate, but her influence waned as Theodora's power tightened. When news reached him that the empress was dying, he said nothing. He merely walked to the harbour and stood watching the sea for a long time, as if the tide might bring back some part of his youth. Within weeks, word came of Theodora's death. The court mourned with grandeur. Belisarius did not mourn at all. He simply felt the air grow lighter, though he knew it would not last. Across the Apennines, Totila advanced steadily. Town after town changed hands. Belisarius, outnumbered and underfunded, could only delay him. He fought small actions, rescuing besieged garrisons, reclaiming a port here, a fortress there, acts of resistance rather than conquest. His letters to Justinian became pleas. "If you wish Italy to live, you must send life." No help came. Even his victories carried the scent of futility. Soldiers fought bravely but went unpaid. Supplies dwindled. He pawned his own silver to feed them. "We cannot starve and be virtuous," he told his officers. "One must yield." Yet he never abandoned discipline. The army held together by the force of his will, moving through Italy like a fragment of an older, nobler age. By 548, the campaign had become a slow retreat disguised as defense. Rome fell, rose, and fell again. Its citizens weary of changing masters. In the ruins of its basilicas, monks prayed for an end to deliverance. The general's hair had turned white. His health faltered. Still, he rode at the head of his men, silent and watchful. Totila, impressed, once sent envoys offering him peace and honors if he would yield the field. "Tell your king," Belisarius replied, "that Rome has not yet yielded me." But the empire had. In the palace, Justinian's attention drifted elsewhere, to new laws, new churches, new visions of eternity. The man who had once rebuilt Rome's dominion could no longer rebuild its faith. On a rain-soaked morning near the coast, Belisarius dismissed the last of his mercenaries, paying them with borrowed coin. When the ships arrived to take him home, he looked back at the desolate shore. Italy had been his greatest victory and his slowest defeat. He boarded without ceremony. Behind him lay the ruins of all he had restored. Ahead, the city that had forgotten how to honor its saviors. The sails caught the wind, and the coast receded into mist. A lesser man might have cursed the emperor. Belisarius only whispered, "I served." The summons came like an echo from a dream that should have ended long ago. Belisarius, now an aging man with eyes hollowed by decades of campaigns, was ordered once more to Italy. The war he had begun was still unfinished, and the emperor needed him again, or perhaps only the legend of him, a name to mask the empire's weakness. The general obeyed without protest. Habit had long replaced hope. When he landed at Salona, the old port on the Adriatic, he found the army that awaited him scarcely worthy of the name. The survivors of earlier campaigns were dead, scattered, or disillusioned. In their place stood 4,000 recruits, boys, mercenaries, and refugees who had never seen battle. Against them stood Totila, king of the Goths, commanding 25,000 hardened warriors. The numbers told their own prophecy, yet Belisarius would not abandon the field. "One does not measure faith in arithmetic," he told his officers. Italy greeted his return without celebration. Its soil had been plundered too many times. Its cities were exhausted, trading one conqueror for another. Totila, now in the full strength of his youth, ruled not by terror, but by mercy. He restored laws, reduced taxes, and won over the people who had once looked to Constantinople for salvation. Where the imperial tax collectors had left resentment, he sowed loyalty. In that sense, he had already conquered much of Italy before a single battle. Belisarius's first task was to retake Rome, which had once again fallen to the Goths. He marched south through country that no longer looked like the Italy of the Caesars. Fields overgrown, aqueducts broken, villages turned to cemeteries. When his small army reached the outskirts of the city, he found its gates open and its streets empty. A skeleton of marble and silence. The Goth garrison had withdrawn temporarily, leaving ruins inhabited by beggars and wild dogs. The general ordered what repairs he could. He shored up the walls, dug trenches, and sent riders pleading for grain and men. Constantinople remained quiet. For weeks, he labored among the wreckage. He slept in the atrium of a ruined palace, the mosaics above him depicting the triumphs of emperors long dead. At times, he walked alone along the forum, where grass grew between the stones, and wondered if the empire he served still existed except in memory. Yet when scouts brought word that Totila was advancing, he felt the old fire return. Rome must be defended, he said, not because it can be held, but because it must not be abandoned. The Gothic army encamped outside the walls in spring. Their king sent envoys bearing generous terms, peace, amnesty, and estates in Italy if the Romans would withdraw. Belisarius listened, then shook his head. "Tell your master," he replied, "that Rome will change hands only through valor." Totila admired the answer. He ordered that captured Romans be treated well, and that the general's courage be honored even in opposition. For months, the two men waged a war of movement and exhaustion. Belisarius's handful of cavalry raided supply trains, burned bridges, and harassed Gothic outposts. Totila's larger forces hemmed him in, denying grain and reinforcements. Hunger became the empire's most persistent enemy. Soldiers boiled leather and weeds for food. Some deserted, only to be cut down by their own comrades. Yet the old general never broke discipline. He told his men, when an army loses order, it loses God. Reinforcements were promised repeatedly from the east, but none arrived. Justinian, drained by plague and war, sent only letters of encouragement and a few thousand coins, barely enough to pay for bread. "The emperor," Belisarius remarked, "believes words can march." He refused to despair, though he knew the truth. He was fighting not merely the Goths, but neglect. In early summer, the general managed one last stroke of audacity. Learning that Totila had withdrawn part of his army to the south, he rode out at night with a small detachment, seized the port of Ostia, and reopened a tenuous lifeline to the sea. Grain from Sicily began to trickle in. For a brief moment, Rome breathed again. But fortune, that old traitor, soon turned. A storm wrecked half the supply fleet, and Totila, swift as rumor, returned before the next convoy could arrive. The noose tightened. Inside the walls, famine gnawed through the ranks. The dead went unburied. Dogs prowled the streets. Yet even in this misery, Belisarius's calm never faltered. He kept the lamps burning in his headquarters, dictating dispatches that might never be read, maintaining the forms of command so that despair could not become law. "As long as we obey," he said, "the empire lives." When the end came, it came through exhaustion, not defeat. A false rumor reached him that the Goths had captured Portus, the harbor fortress. Belisarius, believing his last refuge lost and his wife Antonina taken, abandoned the siege works to rush to her rescue. The report proved false, but the damage was done. The opportunity to break the encirclement had passed. Totila tightened control around the city, and after weeks of stalemate, Rome fell once more. Totila entered in restraint, forbidding massacre. He admired his adversary too much for cruelty. When Belisarius was allowed to withdraw, the Gothic king sent a message after him. There is no shame in yielding to necessity. Among Romans, you alone are still a Roman. The words reached him like a benediction and a wound. He retreated south, his army, a remnant of weary ghosts. In Campania, he established a small coastal camp, keeping contact with Sicily and the eastern supply routes. There he spent his days overseeing repairs, his nights staring into the waves. Antonina returned to him briefly with news from the capital. Theodora was dead. Justinian ruled alone. She urged him to come home, to rest. "I have never learned how," he answered. The emperor, at last recognizing the futility of further struggle, recalled him in the following year. The summons was couched in courtesy, but its tone carried dismissal. The general was told to return for consultation, a phrase that meant retirement. He obeyed without bitterness. "Italy will outlast us all," he said to his officers. "Let us go home before it buries us." As the ships weighed anchor, he stood on deck, gazing toward the dark outline of the peninsula fading into mist. Behind him lay years of glory and ruin. Ahead, a city that honored and feared him in equal measure. The sea breeze lifted his grey hair, carrying with it the faint scent of ash and olive. He had once crossed these waters as a conqueror, then as a savior. Now he returned as a relic of both. When Constantinople's domes rose on the horizon, gleaming like polished gold beneath the sun, Belisarius felt no triumph, only a vast fatigue. He had given the empire his youth, his victories, and the faith of his soldiers, and in return received suspicion and silence. Yet as the harbour drew near, he realized he would have done it all again. For men like him, loyalty was not a virtue, it was a destiny. 2 decades passed between Belisarius's last campaign and his final reckoning. The empire he had bled to restore was weary once more, its conquests hollowed by rebellion and neglect. Africa seethed under corrupt governors. Italy languished between Gothic ghosts and imperial tax collectors. And in the east, Persia pressed the frontiers again. Only Constantinople remained splendid, a city of marble facades and anxious hearts, outwardly eternal, inwardly afraid. In that aging capital, the old general lived in uneasy peace. His house overlooked the Golden Horn, its garden grown wild, its halls filled with trophies gathering dust. The emperor had granted him wealth enough to live, but not influence enough to matter. He was summoned rarely, consulted less. The armies he had once led were commanded now by younger men who studied his campaigns as legend rather than memory. They greeted him at banquets as one might greet a statue. Justinian, too, had aged into a figure of marble, stern, devout, untouchable. He still passed laws and raised churches, but his eyes saw less of the world and more of eternity. The Empress Theodora was long dead, yet her shadow lingered in his household. Courtiers who had once feared her now practiced her art of suspicion, whispering poison in the imperial ear. It was said that the emperor trusted no one, least of all those who had served him too well. In that atmosphere of envy, Belisarius's name was a provocation. He was still too famous, still too beloved by soldiers and citizens alike. People pointed him out in the streets, telling their children, "That man saved Rome." Such reverence, innocent in the mouths of the poor, became dangerous in the corridors of power. Every salute to the general was an insult to the emperor's pride. The spark came from triviality. A case of corruption in the provinces. A governor accused of embezzlement who sought refuge under Belisarius's patronage. The general had given him shelter, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of old friendship. Enemies at court seized the chance. They wove accusations of conspiracy, claiming Belisarius plotted to seize power with loyal veterans hidden across Thrace. The charges were absurd, yet they fit the mood of a court that preferred treason to truth. In 562, he was arrested in his own house. The soldiers who came for him hesitated before his door, uncertain how to address the man who had once commanded half the known world. Belisarius met them without protest. "Do your duty," he said quietly. They led him through the streets where, 20 years before, he had paraded in triumph. Now the crowd watched in stunned silence as their savior passed in chains. The trial was a formality. The accusations, theft, treason, corruption, contradicted each other so thoroughly that belief became unnecessary. The verdict had been written before the court convened. He was stripped of rank, property, and honors, confined to his estate under guard. Justinian signed the decree with trembling hand. "The law must be blind," he murmured, "even to loyalty." Blindness. That word would cling to the general's legend forever. Some later said that his eyes were put out by imperial order, that he wandered the streets of Constantinople as a beggar, crying, "Give an obol to Belisarius." Whether truth or rumor, it captured what the empire wished to forget, that it had devoured its own greatness. In reality, his punishment was quieter, but no less cruel. He lived under watch, a prisoner of memory. Friends who visited him found him courteous, detached, as if speaking from another century. He read histories, corrected their errors, and sometimes laughed at the absurdities of men who believed glory could outlast gratitude. When the emperor's health began to fail, public feeling turned again toward mercy. The people petitioned for the general's pardon. Justinian, now nearly 90 and haunted by his own past, relented. The charges were dismissed, his property restored, his name cleared. It was a pardon granted too late. The man who received it was already beyond ambition. "The world," he told a visitor, "is a garrison. One enters to serve and leaves when the watch is done." He withdrew to his estate near the St. Romanus Gate, where the city's noise faded into the murmuring of the sea. Occasionally, passers-by glimpsed him walking along the shore at dusk, his cloak plain, his head uncovered. Children ran beside him, begging for stories of battles they had only heard in song. He would smile faintly and say, "Wars are won by those who remember what they fight for." In his final winter, he fell ill. The doctors spoke of fever, but those close to him said it was weariness. His last visitor was a former soldier who had served at Dara, now bent and grey. They spoke of trenches and comrades long gone, of cities taken and lost again. "Do you regret it?" the old soldier asked. Belisarius looked toward the sea. "Regret," he said, "is for those who could have done more. I did all that was given to me." He died quietly, without ceremony, sometime in the last months of 565. The same year his emperor followed him into the grave. The chroniclers record no grand funeral, only that he was buried at his own expense, near the walls he had once defended. When news reached the people, they mourned him with a grief deeper than pomp could express. Some swore they had seen him afterward, cloaked and blind, standing at the city gate. Others claimed his ghost still walked the ramparts at dusk, guarding the empire that had betrayed him. Whether myth or mercy, that vision endured. The last Roman sentinel, eyes empty, still watching for enemies who no longer came. And if, in the centuries that followed, poets embellished his fall, they did so because the truth needed no defense. Rome's final general had served with genius and fidelity, had rebuilt the empire only to see it crumble again, and had asked for nothing but duty. History, fickle and forgetful, gave him instead a legend of blindness, a punishment the world imagined for itself. As the news spread that the emperor was dead, no bells rang, no banners rose. Constantinople simply fell silent. In the great palace by the sea, the curtains were drawn and the servants whispered, as though fearing to wake a sleeper who might yet command them. Justinian, who had outlived every rival, every war, every love, was gone at last, and with him ended an age. He had ruled for nearly 4 decades, a reign of cathedrals and codes, of conquests and plagues. The empire he left behind gleamed in marble, but crumbled beneath the surface. Africa seethed with revolt. Italy bled under new Gothic wars. The eastern provinces waited for the next Persian incursion. His cities were magnificent, his treasury empty. To the world he had restored Rome. To his subjects he had drained it. Yet in the chronicles of men he would be called great. The chroniclers wrote too of the general who had served him, the soldier who never crowned himself. Belisarius had died a few months before his master, leaving behind no heirs, no memoirs, no monuments save memory. They were bound together, even in death. Emperor and servant, faith and doubt, glory and its cost. One had ruled the world, the other had saved it. Neither had found peace. When the emperor's body was laid in the church of the Holy Apostles, the city gathered to see the last of its maker. Old soldiers stood among the crowds, their faces scarred and grey. Some had marched under Belisarius at Dara. Some had defended the walls of Rome. Some had survived the plague that had carried away half their kin. As the procession passed, one of them muttered, "He rebuilt the world and forgot the men who held it up." No one contradicted him. Beyond the city's walls, the empire continued by habit. Armies still drilled on the Danube. Merchants still sailed from Alexandria. Monks still argued over theology, while the frontiers shifted mile by mile. Yet something vital had gone out of the imperial heart. The vision that had once stretched from the sands of Africa to the snows of Thrace now felt distant, like a song remembered rather than sung. The empire would survive for centuries, but the age of men who believed in its destiny was over. In the decades that followed, stories about Belisarius grew like ivy over ruins. The soldiers who had once served him told their children of the general who built trenches in the desert and mills on broken aqueducts, who fought with 4,000 against 25,000 and never despaired. Poets turned his life into parable. The loyal man betrayed, the sighted hero made blind by ingratitude. Monks repeated his name in sermons as a warning and a prayer, that wisdom should never outlive humility, nor service outshine its master. Even in the West, where Rome's shadow had long faded, the tales endured. Travelers crossing the Alps spoke of the last Roman, a man who had fought to bind together a world already dissolving. His story passed through centuries, changing shape but not soul. Wherever men served powers greater than themselves, they remembered him. It is said that in later years, long after the empire's final fall, a traveller from distant lands asked a monk in Constantinople what had become of the general's house. The monk led him to a quiet garden by the sea. "There," he said, pointing to a tangle of stones and wild fig trees. That was Belisarius's home. The traveller stood for a while, listening to the wind. "Did he die blind?" he asked. The monk smiled faintly. "No," he said. but perhaps the world did. For in truth, Belisarius had seen too much: the fall of cities, the rot of courts, the vanity of kings. His sight, whether dimmed or clear, had spanned the full distance from greatness to futility. In his life, the Roman story found its last complete circle: rise, triumph, and slow eclipse. He had fought in the empire's final blaze of strength, and his death left behind only its afterglow. History moved on. New peoples came from the north, new creeds from the desert. The legions became memory, the Latin tongue a relic, the ancient roads half buried under grass. Yet in the quiet halls of libraries and in the echo of old chronicles, the name Belisarius remained, not as conqueror, but as measure. He was the proof that loyalty can be as heroic as rebellion, that genius can serve without ambition, that the end of an empire need not be the end of its honor. On winter evenings, when the sun sank behind the domes of Constantinople, the sea below the old walls turned red with reflected light. The watchers on the ramparts said it looked like a flame that would never go out, though all who tended it were gone. They were right. Empires die, but the fire that drives men to defend them, that peculiar blend of faith, pride, and sorrow, endures. So ends the story of the last great Roman general, born in a twilight, faithful in the ruins, uncorrupted by victory, unbroken by disgrace. The empire he served became dust, yet his memory still stands guard over its ashes, the final light of Rome shining even as night closed in.